Now moving on to interpretive approaches and the criticisms essentially of Durkheim's work. Just to say that interpretive approaches stress that the society operates operates through people interacting on the basis of shared meanings. And it talks about how these shared meanings are constructed. And they deny that science or the scientific principle, scientific method, is applicable to the study of society. The first study that we're going to look at is the meaning of suicide. It's probably worth pointing out that Douglas's work was a lot later, 1967, than the turn of the 20th century work that Durkheim completed. He saw that the meaning of suicide was different, very different in each case. And what he was looking at was to say, Durkheim assumed that suicide was one thing, is a straightforward thing, straightforward definition, it is what it is. Whereas Douglas points out that there are at least 4 potential meanings for the act, which are completely different from each other. So he talks first of the first option being transforming the self. That is gaining release from the woes of the world. So this is the idea that maybe you have a terminal illness or your life is simply unbearable to live in terms of pain, etc. So you take your life in order to transform it, to take yourself away from whatever that situation may be. The idea of transforming yourself for others. This is the idea of profound feelings on a particular issue. It's to some extent suicide as a form of protest. In Vietnam and in other cases, this has gone as far as self-immunization, in other words, burning yourself to death to protest. In the case of Vietnam, it was the Buddhist monks protesting the reforms the government put to their religion. So it is about an extreme form of trying to reach out to the fellow feeling of others. Then he talks about, transforming oneself for others. The next one is achieving fellow feeling. And this is that asking for help or cry for help idea. This is where suicide attempts, if they are suicide attempts, may not be ones which want to end in death. Is so-called parasuicide, you know, the typical jilted lover who threatens to take pills, and as the lover comes, the strange lover comes back to them, and so on, and it's a threat. And so that is a completely different meaning, and this is what Douglas is driving at, because if you have different meanings, you can't talk about them as the same thing. The last, which is gaining revenge, is forced into a position where they have to feel they have to commit suicide. This is our extreme circumstances, a last act of defiance, if you like, throwing in the towel, not allowing, faced with defeat, the last choice they have is to take their own lives. The conclusions that Douglas draws are that Durkheim's analysis is deeply flawed. The scientific method is an example of what not to do in sociological research. There is no single act that can be termed suicide, since the meaning individuals place on their acts are so different. It is a mistake to categorize them as the same thing. Only thing these categories have in common is death. rather than any other meaning attached to it. Now moving on to Atkinson, 1971. First of all, he talks about the socially constructed nature. So the study is called The Social Construction of Suicide. And it looks at suicide as a socially constructed thing. In this case, it's a process by which a coroner comes to the conclusion in an inquest or the basis of death. So it's that idea that instead of statistics reflecting some kind of hardcore social fact that is immutable and uncountable and scientifically measurable, what it suggests is suicide is constructed through a social process which is open to the biases of individuals and the map they hold of the world in their head. And in this case, it's the coroner who suggests, and so it is suggested that the official statistics reflect the coroner's decisions rather than an underpinning reality, meaning it is what coroners say it is rather than the reality of it itself. Atkinson turns first to suicide notes. Suicide note would indicate a clear marker, wouldn't it, that this is suicide. There's a suicide note, I've committed suicide, and I'll tell you because. What Atkinson points out that only in 30% of cases is a suicide note found. He posits here, or he suggests that this may be because the family will have destroyed them, because it may include in the note some rather unpleasant accusations towards the family. So that essence of, if you're looking for a suicide note, there may not be one, and the evidence may be tampered with. This is a social process. It doesn't reflect just what the reality of the world is around it. And then we go on to modes of death. So understandably, a coroner looking for clues will look for more typical modes of suicide. So, if someone has hung themselves in the woods, yeah, look, that's what you'd expect, isn't it? Or someone's overdosed on pills, or someone's thrown themselves under a train. But it almost by definition excludes those that have deliberately allowed their lives to slip away or taken their lives in a surreptitious. It completely ignores all those ones other than the stereotypical ones that we would understand suicide to be taking place. Similarly, that was talking about modes of death. That's a prejudice there. But when you look at the location and circumstances, they're looking for the clues that fit the picture, and that the event has taken place in circumstances that will not be discovered. So, if it's a proper suicide, they needed to take themselves away with no chance of being discovered and set it up in such a way as they were definitely going to stay. There's a series of assumptions about what suicide is or what the individual is doing in those circumstances, which may or may not be true. But it builds to this idea that it's a socially constructed element, that it is not just something that happened. The last element here is life, history, and mental condition. It assumes that someone who takes their own life must be depressed or must have a series of circumstances in their lives that pushes them to that point. So the coroner does his best or her best to search for these events. However, again, this shows the social nature of the process because it allows the prejudice or preconceived idea of the coroner influence the outcome as diagnosed. So it just again points to the social nature of the event.